And you mentioned they are trying to do this through education. And let's go directly in this Marxification of education, because you also wrote a book about this. Can you explain us how they took over? We call this march through institutions. How they took over institutions, exactly education.
So just historically speaking, they attempted to take over the culture kind of directly through riots and so on in the 1960s, 68, 69. The city of Detroit, as people probably all around the world know, still has not recovered. It went from one of the best cities in America to very poor and dangerous now. It hollowed out the city. So these riots failed. America did not accept this kind of neo-Marxist communist revolution in the direct form. And so you have the kind of architects of this, people like Herbert Marcuse, who was a critical theorist in the Frankfurt School, the School of Marxism for the West, critical theory. And he comes out and says, we're going to do the long march through the institutions in his book, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, that he wrote in 1972. And he says, in particular, we're going to go into education at all levels. Because what he understood was everybody in the entire professional class in advanced economy went to college. Every single one of them, almost to a man. You have people who, whether they're lawyers, whether they're journalists, whether they're in media, they went to communication school. Even if they are a pastor in a church, they probably went to a seminary. So they are all educated people. Educated people are in every professional class. And that's how society is actually controlled. So he says, we're going to go in. We're not going to yell outside in the street anymore. We're going to go into the professions, and we're going to change them from within. That's called the long march through the institutions. It took them through the entire 1970s into the early 1980s to start making any real headway. But it started actually with people during the end of the Vietnam War era staying into college longer so they could get advanced degrees instead of going to fight in the war. So they were able to protest the war and get an advanced degree. You get this huge number of PhDs coming out of the early 1970s as a result. Almost all of them go off to become college professors somewhere and start to populate the colleges. They're all leftists. They're all this new left thinking. They're going into education at all levels. In the 80s, they started to take over the schools of education to complete this program. A guy named Henry Giroux is his name, went around in the early 1980s and intentionally got 100 radicals. He brags about it. He got 100 radicals tenured in colleges of education all over North America, but especially in the United States. And the goal was so that they could bring in this new radical education system that he believed in, that came from a Brazilian Marxist named Paulo Freire. And this is what the book, The Marxification of Education, is about. Because Paulo Freire created a new model. He was one of these post-colonial guys in Brazil, and he said that it was capitalism and colonialism that kept the peasant poor. And he came up with this new idea that education should be the way that you convince people of the Marxist interpretation of their circumstances. So you're poor, why? Well, let's learn to read, but while we learn to read, let's learn to read the social situation. Let's learn to read the politics. He played this kind of language trick. And he said that political literacy is actually more important than actually being able to read as literacy. So his expression, to use the technical phrase, is that the academic material will become a mediator to political knowledge. What that means for the everyday person is, whether it's math, whether it's reading, whether it's science, whatever, the lesson in the school becomes an excuse to talk about politics. So you bring up the math question and you use the math question as an excuse to talk about a political issue. You say, maybe, in this subtraction problem, we're talking about how far somebody's going to drive. Well, is it really good to drive that far? Let's talk about environmental issues. And so then you talk about the political issue instead. Or you talk about a family and you say, well, there's a mom and a dad and this and that and this. And then you say, does every family have a mom and a dad, or can some families be two moms or whatever? And you can talk about feminism or the sexuality stuff in place of the academic lesson. And this was what he called education for liberation. And this got retooled into something called critical pedagogy as it came to the United States. And then critical pedagogy became called culturally relevant education. These are all, buzzwords, but these are the names that you can track how this got installed in the U.S. education system. And of course, the U.S. education system then spread it to the world. But what developed in Brazil under this Paulo Freire is what he created is a Marxist theory of knowing, of knowledge. So some people have declared themselves to be knowers and other people are ignorant. And it's not that they really know more, it's that they've decided what counts as knowing. So they're like a bourgeoisie of knowledge. And they keep everybody else ignorant and impoverished so that they can't get the good job, so they can't control society. And so you see that they are able to therefore control everything through who's allowed to be considered knowledgeable. And so his goal is to then say, you know what? No, your knowledge of your own circumstances is real knowledge. Your personal lived experience is real knowledge. It counts just as much as the scientist, as the accountant, as the politician, as the professional. It's knowledge too. They don't want you to know that, but it is. And let me tell you what it really means. And then they give them a Marxist interpretation of the experience that they have to go out and agitate with. And this was his program.
That means they indoctrinate all the students. And finally, if you come with your degree, with your diploma, and then you know better than others, and then they're using this knowledge, as you said, to preserve you that they are right.
Yes, and to put specifically to favor hiring Marxist radicals as professionals. So, this is what the kind of DEI, or the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion program was all about, is it's about setting up a stage where somebody who understands the Marxist perspective on their identity is more correct and more valid and more moral and more righteous than somebody who doesn't. So you preferentially hire radical activists to bring them into every single institution: education, media, law, medicine. And then this is where we are now. All of our institutions, our medical societies, our law societies, our media, obviously, a lot of our politicians all get captured by this because there's a preferential hiring program that gets introduced alongside. And that's what we call DEI. And again, I stress that's what the Soviets called korenizatsiya. It's as a well-known playbook for bringing the outsider in. And then if anybody criticizes them, it's some kind of chauvinism. In Russia, it was the great Russian chauvinism. How dare you criticize a Ukrainian comrade? It's great Russian chauvinism. And now it's how dare you criticize this, black woman? That's sexism and racism. It's the same exact playbook.